Gardens for us have always been a fascinating place to photograph, whether by day or by night. Our goal is to create pictures that are clear and precise, but that also are intuitive, lyrical, and aim for poetry. The night is so beautiful and strange and mysterious, and what happens in a garden at night is nothing short of magical. Tonight we want to talk a little about our personal projects and how they came to be and how they developed, and especially the story at National Geographic. This image came from a New York Times assignment in 2001, trying to do a story on finding peace and zen in this absolutely crazy hustle and bustle city of Tokyo. Toward the end of the trip, the cherry blossoms started to bloom, and we were just absolutely fascinated by the Japanese passion for this ephemeral time of cherry blossoms and the metaphor of that in their life. Even in the pouring rain, people would come out at night for the illuminated cherry blossom festival. So we just found that to be absolutely wonderful. And this picture was the germ, I think, and the catalyst for our deciding to travel down that path to the Midnight Garden.
This first group of images is from Old Westbury Gardens on Long Island in New York. So why gardens at night? I think maybe let's start first with the concept of why gardens. In our landscape work, we're interested in the forces of nature that sculpt the land. And we're also interested in the marks that humans leave behind, both positive and negative. So this project has to do with the age-old human impulse to create beautiful landscapes. The garden, after all, is a little piece of paradise, no matter how small a slice.
We were particularly inspired by the cultures of the Middle East and China and Japan. And their approach to the nocturnal garden is one of refuge, inspiration, and poetry and creativity. We decided to join them and take that leap into darkness. In our research, we found thousands of pictures of cities, parks, landscapes, all made at night. And although we found written references to gardens at night, there were precious few pictures. We could not seem to find any pictures of gardens at night. So it wasn't just a leap into darkness we were about to take, it was a leap into the void as well.
This is also from Old Westbury Gardens. I mean, to state the obvious, gardens look way different at night. And that has a good deal to do with how our eyes function. Within our eyes are retinas that are composed of rods and cones. At the center of the retina are the cones, and that is how we perceive color. But we need a certain amount of light to be able to see color, for those cones to work. Around the outer edges of the retina are the rods, and that is our light perception. To put it another way, if you're an owl, you have a lot of rods in your eyes, and therefore you have terrific, terrific night vision. A colorblind person, although they might have cones in their eyes, those cones aren't functioning, and therefore they don't perceive color the way we do. A normal vision is.
So essentially in a garden at night, we're nearly colorblind.
This next series of images is from a garden called Lotus Land, which is in Montecito, California, near Santa Barbara. And it's actually the first garden that we photographed at night.
Also, we knew this garden had a very extensive collection of silvery succulents and some very interesting water features. Since it was our first garden, we could only guess that this would be very ripe material for the moonlight.
The owner of Ghana Volska actually started out her career being an opera singer. She didn't have very much success with that because she had stage fright and she couldn't keep her key. Not so good for opera. But she did have a really great talent for marrying exponentially richer husbands, which she did 6 times. And by the time number 6 rolled around, she also had developed a passion for gardening. She was a very eccentric person, and she was quite excessive in her garden design. So why have 2 golden barrel cactus when you're going to have 24? She was about abundance.
So we got permission to spend 4 consecutive nights at Lotus Land, and boy, did we ever need all 4 of those nights. Just stumbling around in the dark, learning the ropes and issues of how to make pictures this way.
For years, I had been making landscape pictures and always had to translate the real world back into black and white. I had to pre-visualize it. Now, for the first time, what was before me was as I would see it later in a print. I would look through the viewfinder and see black and white pictures. I was like a kid in a candy store.
Now, my eyes might not be able to perceive color at night, but with a very long exposure, film does quite well recording it. The sky is black, right? I always thought it was, but what happens here? Film brings it back to deep blue. I could not see any of those dark greens back there. And the flower, forget it. I mean, at best, you might guess that there's color in that flower, but red is actually the first color to go at night. So it was my turn to reimagine what this black and white world in front of me was going to look like in color.
In our reading about gardens at night, I had come across numerous references to how extraordinary the aromas of night blooming flowers are, that they're absolutely intoxicating. And until making this picture of the night blooming saguaro at Lotus Land, I had never experienced it. I mean, the reason why these nighttime flowers are so fragrant is that the pollinators that they need to attract have very poor vision, and they need to be lured to those blossoms by the scent.
Every time we get permission to photograph a new garden, we have a checklist that we go over with the director or the security people. I mean, we're about to be locked in for the night, and we have to make sure that we've accounted for everything. So the list goes something like this. How do we get out when we're finished? Is there a bathroom open? What's the phone number of security? Are all the lights turned off? And please do leave the fountains turned on.
When I was making this picture at Lotus Land, I had another camera set up on the Great Lawn. And not long into that exposure, I heard this sound. And I knew that there was something that we had forgotten to put on our checklist. I had to run through a gauntlet of sprinklers to go rescue my camera. This was November. And what I can tell you is I don't recommend taking outdoor showers on the Pacific Coast at 3 a.m.
And you can be sure that please turn off the automated sprinkler system went to the very top of our list.
This image was made on our last night at Lotus Land, and we're checking weather conditions and all of that, but this unexpected fog rolled in from the Pacific Coast, and both of us gasped. Moonlight is beautiful enough on its own, but when it's refracted and diffused by fog, it's just really extraordinary. And I have to say, this was one of the most magical moments. And as quickly as it came in, it was gone. Poof.
I think we each got one exposure. So this next group is from the Huntington Gardens in San Marino, California. It contains one of the world's premier desert gardens, one of our favorites. And what we learned from Lotus Land was that silvery plants, like this old man cactus, look really, really cool when they catch the light of the full moon. So if you're really going to photograph only by the light of the full moon, you have about 4 ideal nights out of the whole month to shoot. That's when the moon is brightest. And if you get some miserable weather in those 4 nights, you're out of luck until the next month.
Sometimes we do get a little help from artificial lighting. When I was making this picture, I was backed up against a greenhouse, and there was some ambient light coming off it. It was dim, but it's creating a different kind of glow. Early on in the project, we decided to not fight the issue of artificial light from streets or light pollution from cities, but to just simply go with it. This next group is from Vizcaya, which is in Miami, Florida. It's the former winter estate of James Deering. This is a high-walled secret garden, which is very typical of an Italian garden. Secret gardens were meant to be private places for the family to retreat or for romantic trysts. I think one of the gifts of photographing at night is that it's a very meditative process. You find yourself being removed from the day-to-day frenzy of life and deadlines, and it really does make you slow down.
So we think the only people more patient than photographers are gardeners. I mean, we have no qualms about waiting 8 hours for the light to be just right, or going back to a place several times to make a better picture. But I'll be darned if I'll ever have the patience to say, wait 20 years to see if a tree looks good in that corner of the garden. So we've been trumped.
This massive live oak tree is on the grounds of Middleton Place, which is just outside of Charleston, South Carolina. We wanted to photograph this particular garden because it's the oldest landscape garden in America. Henry Middleton began this garden creation in 1741, and it was the premier garden of the 13 colonies. It fell into ruin after the Civil War, but since all the original plans and planting notes had survived, the garden's been restored.
So the director of Middleton Place gave us a daytime tour of the grounds, and his parting words before he left us for our nighttime work was, "Oh, by the way, there are ghosts here." I got spooked by this the day before when we were scouting before him. But there are 4 statues in this secret garden representing the 4 seasons. This is Miss Winter. At some point in my exposure, my camera died. My camera battery died. So to change the battery, I had to put on my headlamp. And believe it or not, that died. So now I walk over to the bench into my camera bags and I dig up my flashlight and I'm trying to hold it in my teeth, and that battery dies. So I'm really spooked by this lady right now. She does not want her picture taken. So the next day, it's daytime, broad daylight. I see her again, beautiful lights hitting her. I'm about to take a picture, and this biggest bumblebee that I had ever seen in my life comes flying straight at my face, stops 2 inches from me, and hovers and buzzes, and I am so freaked out. So I just look up finally at the statue and I say, "Okay, you win." Luckily for me, that battery that died that first night, I got just enough exposure under my belt to get this photograph here. But I do believe in ghosts.
When we went to this private garden in Bedford Hills, New York, we'd done our research. We knew what time the moon was rising. We knew what time it was going to set. But the weirdest thing happened that night. When the moon should have been at the high point in the sky, it was so low it wasn't rising over the tree line. So the next day, we set about trying to figure out what exactly had happened. We were making jokes that night. What's the moon so lazy? It's not going to rise up. What's going on here? We learned something about the moon, that it wobbles in its orbit. And at that night, we were experiencing what happens every 18.6 years. It's a low moon.
If you want to experience the next low moon, it's going to be in 2020. In the meantime, to get this photograph, I took out my trusty flashlight, which is sometimes the next best thing to moonlight. So with all the problems of wobbling moons, attack sprinklers, dew point, mosquitoes, you name it, why do we do what we do? And we think finally the answer is actually quite simple. The night is so beautiful and strange and mysterious, and what happens in a garden at night is nothing short of magical.
What we're doing here in Claude Monet's garden in Giverny, France, is we've turned a flashlight on to critically focus. We rarely use autofocus when we're photographing landscape, but when it's dark, that feature doesn't work anyway. And after focusing, the flashlight goes off. And this is the famous Japanese bridge that Claude Monet had constructed in his garden in Giverny. The sole purpose of him creating and planting this garden was that it would be the subject of his Impressionist paintings. So it wasn't following any kind of formal design scheme of gardens. It was just this color I want here, these flowers I want there, and I want a lily pond.
This was one of the brief moments when the moon actually made an appearance at Giverny. It rained almost every night. Our French guide said, "This is most unusual. June is usually such a dry month." In choosing when to go to each garden, it's not just the nocturnal narrative that makes us decide. You know, it's the blooms, what's going to be in bloom at any given moment, and when is the greatest likelihood that we might get some clear nights. But climate change has made counting on historic averages so incredibly unreliable.
You know, as far as personal taste goes, I'm not really a big fan of 17th century French formal gardens. But the narrative that goes with this particular garden, Vaux-le-Vicomte, was just too compelling, and we had to include it in our story. Nicolas Fouquet, who built Vaux, was Louis XIV's Minister of Finance. He took 5 years to complete his chateau and employed 18,000 workers to build the house and the garden. And to unveil his new estate and garden to the king and the French court, Fouquet decided to plan an elaborate evening fete. And on that evening in August 1661, at the end of the fireworks, the French court erupted in applause. Louis XIV wasn't used to having his court applaud somebody other than him. And no doubt he was spending the evening wondering how his Minister of Finance could amass such a fortune to build this creation. So 14 days after the event, Louis XIV had Fouquet arrested, and he spent the rest of his life in prison. But with equal swiftness, he hired Fouquet's garden designer, Le Notre, and put him to work at Versailles. Most people think that flowers need sunlight to open, but for our story, we started researching those that only bloom at night. And we timed our trip to Longwood Gardens for mid-August because they have a very impressive collection of tropical night-blooming water lilies, and that most likely at that time of year they would be opening. This particular variety just blooms for 2 nights out of the year.
So when we arrived at Longwood for our second night of photography, the water lily specialist greeted us with the news that one of the blooms of the giant water platters would open that night. "Hurry," he said, "this baby doesn't wait for moonlight to open." So we scrambled and set up a picture. And our first exposure was made about 20 minutes actually before the sun set, and the lily opened 1 minute later. This is the Victoria Longwood Hybrid Giant Water Platter. That's a mouthful. It only opens 1 night a year. And here it is.
So we did manage to get back to Japan, the country that was really the catalyst for beginning our project. The evening viewing of cherry blossoms, which generally happens in April, was just such an important ritual. It was just essential for us to photograph it for the story.
So we made this image on our last night in Kyoto. For over 1,000 years, there has been an annual cherry blossom festival at the Hirano shrine. The tradition of sakura has always been seen as a metaphor for life itself, at moments luminous and beautiful, yet always fleeting. After our time in Kyoto, we fully understood what the Japanese have been practicing for centuries, and that is this, that in our busy lives, we need to make time to appreciate the ephemeral nature of life. And that's a good thought to leave you with tonight. Thank you.